Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very, very good to see you. Very good to be here. Very good to continue my odyssey through English royal palaces and take off where I left off last time. I was talking about the palaces of Oliver Cromwell, which wasn't in fact a contradiction in terms, as I demonstrated, and I suggested that Oliver Cromwell was actually really rather influenced by French fashion. And today the theme continues because I'm moving on to 1660 and to the Restoration. And as you will see over the next 45 minutes or so, French fashion continues to dominate the scene as far as English royal palaces are concerned. But of course, the Republic dealt a devastating blow to the stock of royal residences which Charles I had enjoyed. Several of them, like Richmond, which you see here on the screen, were simply never to be occupied again. And others, like Greenwich, which you see here, despite plans to the contrary, were never again to retain their former position. But in many respects, I think, the Commonwealth was actually more of a sort of catalyst in a process which had begun much earlier in the 17th century. Changing functional requirements, changing patterns of royal movement, changing modes of transport, architectural taste, and standards of comfort had already started to redraw the royal itinerary and redefine the purposes of many royal residences. The ending of the Republic and the restoration of Charles II provided an opportunity for a new start, a reassessment of royal residential requirements, and Charles II unhesitatingly seized this chance. But the king's plans were constrained by a lack of money, and with the single exception of the remodelling of Windsor Castle, none of his plans really came to fruition. Well, tonight, I'm sorry to say I'm not really going to be talking about Windsor, but what I am going to talk about is the quest that Charles II went on to create for himself a new country house. The reason I'm not going to talk about Windsor is because I'm in the middle of writing a book about it. And I'm actually in the middle of the Charles II chapter. And when I plotted this lecture, I thought I might have finished the chapter by now, but I haven't quite. So maybe I will return to Windsor if I'm given grace to do so on another occasion. But for this evening, I want to start the story of the Restoration with Greenwich. And you see Greenwich here, the palace down by the river, and here you see Charles I and Henrietta Maria standing on the hill above with the Queen's house and the river snaking past. Well, the story of Charles II's Greenwich is very closely bound up with that of the Restoration itself. Since the reign of Henry VII, this house had been always amongst the second or third of the most favoured of all royal residences. But of all the royal houses, it suffered the worst damage during the 1640s and 1650s, and it was fundamentally totally uninhabitable at the Restoration. But because of Greenwich's former popularity, it was widely assumed that the palace would be brought back into a fit state very quickly. And in fact, in May 1661, Charles II ordered a survey of the much damaged royal palace, and within 2 months, the mason, William de Keyser, was already drawing elevations of planned new buildings. On the 19th of October, John Evelyn records in his diary visiting the Surveyor General of the King's Works, Sir John Denham, to discuss the siting of a new palace at Greenwich, noting that Denham was already being assisted by the architect John Webb, a former pupil of Inigo Jones. And in fact, by December 1661, a wooden model had been made of the new palace that Charles wanted to erect. And work very soon after started on the demolition of the remaining bits of the Tudor palace on the site. Now, the evolution of plans for Charles II's new Greenwich is quite complicated. There are a number of plans, but the one I'm showing you here on the screen, I think, makes the point. The The schemes were all for a U-shaped palace. On one side, there were to be a suite of royal apartments for the king, approached by a staircase, and so above here would have been this is the ground floor, of course, but on the first floor, a sort of presence chamber, a guard chamber, privy chamber, a bed chamber, and then closets at the end. But on the other side of the palace, there wasn't what you would have expected in an English royal palace, which was a set of rooms for the Queen. There were a set of large state rooms culminating in a colossal chapel. So this was a unique scheme for any royal palace. There was never a palace designed like this. A palace designed with provision only for the monarch and not for his consort. Now, I suppose you could argue that in 1661 you didn't need to build a queen's side because the king wasn't married. But as early as July 1660, he had been offered the hand of Catherine of Braganza with, very importantly for Charles II, an enormous dowry, and negotiations had started for his marriage. And so I think it's inconceivable that Greenwich was commissioned for a bachelor king. King Charles fully intended to marry. The reason behind this unique plan at Greenwich almost certainly lies in Greenwich's unique position on the River Thames, at the head of the estuary, some 4 miles east of London. Because, of course, the river provided the principal means of access for foreign visitors to get to the capital and see the king. And from the reign of Henry VII, Greenwich had begun to play a special role in the ceremonial reception of ambassadors and other visitors to court. And at the Restoration, Charles II saw no reason not to revive Greenwich's highly individual part in state occasions. You see, before the Restoration, a sort of standard protocol had been developed for welcoming ambassadors. What happened was that the ambassadors and their delegations arrived at Gravesend, and there they would get out of their ships and they would transfer to barges. They'd then be rowed up the river here, and they would arrive at Greenwich, where they were received by a special delegation sent by the king, and they would then transfer after being received, and there had been some prayers said and some celebrations for their safe arrival, into the king's own barge. And the king's own barge would then be rowed from Greenwich to Tower Wharf. And here you see an early 18th century variety of this, but here's the Tower of London, here's Tower Wharf, here is a royal barge conveying an ambassador who's being carried up the steps, and then would be put into the king's barge, the king's coach, which would be driven through the streets of London to Whitehall, where the formal reception would take place. And this protocol for the reception of ambassadors continued under Oliver Cromwell and was restored in 1660. And in fact, we have a very good description of the French ambassador who strangely had been in England since December 1662, but was only formally received in April 1663. And so he had to pretend to land at Greenwich. So he went down to Greenwich by carriage, pretended to land there, was received at Greenwich by the Master of the Ceremonies and various other officials. He was entertained at Greenwich for an hour, and then he was escorted in 4 barges with 6 gentlemen of the King's bedchamber to Tower Wharf. So you see, Greenwich had a very particular ceremonial and diplomatic function entwined with its use as a riverside country seat. Now, precisely what the architectural requirements of this special role was is a bit unclear. But the reception of these large and influential delegations of high-ranking foreign courtiers clearly needed some sort of suitable architectural stage. And it seems as if this large terrace here, which was built in front of the Queen's House, was intended to form part of the auditorium for an ambassadorial reception. Now, these colonnades here, of course, were built for the Naval Museum, or Naval College and the Naval Museum. So this would have been a freestanding building. And you have to imagine the English court perhaps all standing on here with the senior master of ceremonies standing at the top of the steps as the foreign delegation came up to the Queen's house. And in fact, this use of the Queen's house was recognised after Charles II's death by his niece, Queen Mary II, who wrote in 1728 that she desired to make the Queen's house, and I'm quoting, into a small retreat and a place where ambassadors or public ministers might make their entry into London. So there is some corroboration that this was in fact what the use of the Queen's house was for. And so these schemes here, which were devised in 1661 for Charles II, were specially intended to create this sort of ceremonial gateway to the kingdom. The barges could draw up here. The ambassadors could come across this courtyard, being hugely impressed by these long ranges, coming into a ceremonial area here, up the stairs, through endless rooms into a chapel where they'd give thanks for their safe arrival. They then have to march through all these rooms across here on the other side to be received on the king's in the king's thing. So incredibly impressive and deliberately built for impressing foreign ambassadors. And so Charles II started to rebuild his palace at Greenwich, and in fact Samuel Pepys was present for the laying of the foundation stone of the first part of the building, a riverside block, which is now known as King Charles Block. And here you see one of John Webb's drawings for that block. But the energy behind this early and extremely ambitious commission soon fizzled out. And although the King Charles Block, which you see here, was completed, it by 1660 was a boarded up shell. The windows had been boarded up, and the foundations of the next phases that had already been dug were filled in, and Webb's last month's salary was paid, and the account book in the Office of Works was shut. This was largely because of finance. But I think people at the time didn't really realise that the Greenwich project was really over for good. In fact, there were various attempts through the 1660s to start work on the King's side, at least to start fitting out these rooms, which were in fact never fitted out. And so to this very day, nothing here was completed. But of course, as you know, the King Charles Block was incorporated into the hospital for seamen, as was the Queen's house. Here it is, with this later wing put on the back of it. But this is the fragment of the great palace that Charles II wanted to build. Now, I think the really important thing about Charles II's plans for Greenwich is that right from the start, the king had no intention for creating a traditional, what we call a standing house, one of the houses that was kept fully furnished for the use of the king and the court to move to for everyday use. Greenwich, under Charles II, was going to be the ceremonial gateway to the kingdom and not a regular residence. The king's interest in Greenwich was killed by financial constraints, but he was in due course to recover financially, and in the 1770s he started spending money at Windsor Castle, where in fact he was to go on and rebuild Edward III's great royal lodgings with this this range of buildings here, in particular the Star Building, which was to contain his own lodgings. But Windsor Castle was a suburban retreat. It was very closely linked with London. It wasn't a country house. And if we want to understand Charles's next attempt to build a country house, we have to travel far from London to the flat heathlands north of Cambridge at Newmarket. And here at Newmarket, James I had established a hunting lodge. Now, James wasn't, in fact, very keen on the big houses around London. In fact, he spent as little time as possible in London, much preferring to be out and about in the countryside, hunting with his close friends. And as a result, as I explained in an earlier lecture, he established a number of palaces which he converted into hunting lodges for his pleasure. And one of his most important new houses was at Newmarket, where he started leasing an inn in 1605. But he soon bought the inn, knocked it down, and built himself a new house, which became one of his favourite houses. And here James actually entertained ambassadors. He watched plays performed by actors from Cambridge, sort of Cambridge footlights came out to him. And most importantly, he hunted. Now, very sadly, I can't show you a picture of this house, because it's long gone, but it was in fact a pretty ramshackle affair. It was a converted inn with various bits and pieces added onto it over a period of years. This sort of funny collection of buildings in Newmarket was one of this new breed of palaces, a place where the monarch spent a great deal of time far from the hub of government in Westminster. And the attraction of these places like Newmarket for James was hunting. He was an obsessive hunter, never happier when he was chasing a stag in the fields of Cambridgeshire. Charles I, also very interested in hunting, but brought a new dimension to Newmarket because he was also very interested in horse racing. And in fact, we know that the first Gold Cup was run at Newmarket for Charles I in 1634. But it was Charles II who founded the Newmarket that we know today, building the first stables and founding England's most venerable horse training establishment. And Charles wasn't just a spectator. He owned and he rode horses, and amazingly, twice he won the Newmarket Town Plate, a race which is still run to this very day. It was for this reason that Charles II decided to rebuild his father's house at Newmarket so that he could have a palace close to the races. And you see here a rather grainy picture of the house as it was in the 19th century. I'll show you some more pictures of it in a minute. The Italian nobleman, Cosimo de' Medici, who visited Newmarket soon after Charles's buildings were completed, thought that it, and I quote, did not deserve to be called a king's residence. And John Eveling thought the buildings most improper imaginable for a house of sport and pleasure. But despite these very disparaging remarks, Charles II liked the buildings and spent a great deal of time there in the 1670s. The building which you see here in my reconstruction, which I published in Country Life a few years ago, was designed by a very little-known architect called William Samwell. As you see, it was made of brick, had a hipped roof, a cornice, and windows. And it's this long range here, which was the King's range, with his bedchamber here, a front door, very sort of unassuming front door leading up to a staircase here. It was a very innovative building in its way. It had some of the very earliest sashed windows built anywhere in the world, possibly the very first ones. But to us, I think this building would have seemed much more like a large townhouse than for a palace for the monarch of one of England's most powerful countries. Here is my cutaway plan for it, and you can see here that great long range of rooms that I was showing you. This is the King's bedchamber, approached with his back stairs, approached here by a series of outer rooms. Here's the staircase up from the front door. So you can see there were some rooms for entertaining, and also he had some private rooms, some closets at the back for his own comfort. And there were rooms also in the palace on the floor below for the Queen and for the Duke of Monmouth, and over on this side here for the Duke of York. Architecturally modest, but functionally suiting exactly his needs. So what went on in a palace like Newmarket? How did Charles II spend his days there? Well, the diarist John Evelyn spent the night at Newmarket in October 1671, and this is what he found, I quote, "The jolly blades racing, dancing, feasting and revelling, more resembling a luxurious and abandoned rout than a Christian court." Very pious comment. Racing, you see, was not the only entertainment at Newmarket. There was a tennis court, a bowling green, and most important of all, there was a cockpit. Here you see, this is a map of Newmarket. Here you see the Royal Palace, and up here you see the cockpit. And sometimes while the court was in residence, there would be 2 cockfights a day. And the really important thing about all these activities was that whether it was racing, cocking, tennis, bowls, or cards, the outcome was the subject of a wager. This was all about betting. Huge sums of money changed hands here as the courtiers bet on almost every activity that they undertook. Now, as a result of this house, as you can see, it was right on the high street, right in the middle of the town. The fortunes of Newmarket vastly improved. Quite a large number of prominent Caroline noblemen bought houses in the town, including the Duke of Ormond, the Earls of Suffolk and Oxford. But in fact, the very success of Newmarket sowed the seeds of its decline from favour. You see, there were never enough lodgings for the courtiers and the royal household, let alone for any visitors who wanted to come to court. The town had an utterly feeble infrastructure that couldn't cope with the effluent and rubbish produced by so many visitors. And this was a very important reason why the king's attentions began to turn elsewhere. Newmarket, in fact, was soon to be abandoned as Charles's eye had fallen on Winchester. Now, Winchester, in as much as a city can have a self-image, had always seen itself as being royal. It wasn't only one of the 2 ancient royal seats of England, but it had in fact played host to all the Tudor and Stuart monarchs before the Civil War, and in 1647, the mayor and aldermen took the bold step of offering the civic mace to Charles I when he came through the town from the Isle of Wight as a prisoner. And these facts alone would have been an attraction to the newly restored Charles II in 1660, but Windsor actually offered other delights too: good hunting, and most importantly, good racing. Now, racing had actually continued at Winchester through much of the Commonwealth, and at the Restoration, the Corporation of Winchester tried to obtain royal patronage for the sport by placing a notice in the London Gazette, England's first regular newspaper, in July 1682, announcing that the, and I quote, "the inhabitants of this city, being ambitious of the honour of His Majesty's presence, would establish a plate to be run on the Downs at the end of August." And this was done, of course, in the hope that the king and the court would attend. Well, in fact, their invitation was accepted, and the king, queen, and much of the court moved to Winchester at the end of August 1682 for this new race. During this brief stay, the king was welcomed by large crowds. He touched over 60 people for the king's evil, scrofula, and seems, I think, crucially, at that visit, to have settled on the idea of creating a residence there for himself in the city. The city reacted with lightning speed. It sold the king the site of the medieval castle for 5 shillings. It wasn't really a sale. They were basically giving it to him, but they needed to, I suppose, for the National Audit Office to have some cover there. And they also promised him some building timber and to provide carriage. And they even agreed to restrict new leases for building in the city, subject to the development of future royal plans. Now, behind the readiness of the corporation to oblige the king over his building plans lay the fear which was shared by many cities in the early 1680s, which was that of losing their charter and privileges. The incorporated boroughs were being deprived of their privileges by the king on a regular basis. But the city's sort of grovelling approach to the king didn't actually save it from having to surrender its charter, which happened in 1684, and it didn't either ensure a prompt replacement. But there was a big compensation, and that was that the king and the court now came regularly to Winchester, which hugely boosted the city's economy. During the short 1683 summer visit to Winchester, the Crown spent £1,755, 19 shillings and 10pence in the course of their visit. And in due course, Charles II was to outlay more than £44,000 on building a palace there, much of which flowed into local pockets. Now, the king's initial reaction to Winchester and his future plans were widely reported. Just 4 days after their visit, Sir Charles Littleton wrote to Viscount Hatton, saying, "The king is mightily pleased at Winchester. The Duke of York says 'tis abundantly better place for all sorts of pleasure than Newmarket, and 'tis near ye forest for hunting." But there was more to the attraction of Winchester than sport. Littleton continued, I quote again, "There is faction in this business too, ye Whig party being lords at Newmarket, as hunting, got houses and possessed themselves of ye best conveniences there." You see, as I mentioned a few moments ago, many of the best houses around Newmarket belonged to the Whigs, a fact which was at first inconvenient and distasteful to Charles II, and one which, after the events of 1683, proved to be positively perilous. So what happened during 1683? Well, Charles II went to Newmarket, and conditions there had been worsening for some years. But what was really beginning to alienate the king was the depletion of game through overhunting. And in his visit of March 1683, he attempted to remedy this by issuing a proclamation restricting hunting around the town to himself and the court. The contemporary newspaper, The Loyal Protestant, reported on the 9th of March that the country people have much spoiled and destroyed His Majesty's game, which, together with the dirtiness of the town, 'tis said His Majesty is not well pleased with, and it's discoursed that he will not in the future spend so much time in this place as formerly. The king's displeasure was then compounded by the calamity of an extraordinary fire, which later that month reduced almost half the town to ashes, narrowly avoiding the king's own house. John Evelyn believed that the fire had made the king more earnest to render Winchester the seat of his autumnal field diversions for the future. It was, he tells us, infinitely indeed preferable to Newmarket for prospect, for air, pleasure, and provisions. But more serious than the depletion of game or than the fire was the fact that the fire probably saved Charles II's life, as it caused the court to leave Newmarket earlier than planned and thus inadvertently foiled not one, but 2 plots against the king. One to murder him, planned by some Cromwellians from London, and another to capture him as he rode across Newmarket Heath by a number of leading Whigs. Well, what with limited accommodation, poor hunting, dirt, squalor, a major fire, a failed kidnap attempt, and high treason, Newmarket wasn't really looking very fashionable or a good place to be. And so the enthusiasm to build at Winchester increased. So in 1683, Charles relocated himself to Winchester, where he spent most of the month of September. And rather amazingly, we have a surviving list of where the king and his courtiers stayed during the visit. The Queen stayed in the Dean of Winchester's house. The king stayed in the house next door to it, which was fitted up as a sort of mini royal palace. Rather saucily, the house next door was made available for the Duchess of Portsmouth, the king's old mistress, together with one of the king's bastard sons, the Duke of Richmond. And even more bizarrely, just round the corner in another house in the close, belonging to one Dr. Shark, was Nell Gwyn, with one of her children, by the king, the Earl of Burford. Nearby was the Duke of York, the king's brother, and Lord Arlington, the king's Lord Chamberlain. What an extraordinary setup. The close, the cathedral close, filled with the royal family and the king's mistresses and his bastard children. I wonder what the good burghers of Winchester made of it all. Well, the evidence was that they were extremely enthusiastic. The Hampshire grand jury offered the king the Shire Hall, and more ground nearby was granted to him for building work. Land for the new hunting park, over 352 acres, was bought by the king for over £7,000. And at the end of this September visit, the Earl of Sunderland reported, "We are like to be here twice a year, the king growing fonder of his building and the country every day." Now, the commission to build a new palace at Winchester was given to the King's Surveyor of Works, the most senior architect in England, Sir Christopher Wren. Wren had actually waited his entire life for a commission like this. Although he was working on St. Paul's Cathedral, the city parish churches, and he'd made various extensions to palaces like Whitehall, he had never before been asked to design an entire new royal palace from scratch. But there was a problem with this commission. Charles II was in a great hurry. He knew he was getting on, and that if he was to enjoy his new house, it would have to be built at breakneck speed. So huge pressure was put on Christopher Wren to speed the work along. When asked by Charles II to say how soon a new palace could be built, Wren answered, and I quote, "2 years to do the job properly, but 1 year not so well, nor without great confusion, charge, and inconvenience." The king insisted, "If it be possible to do it in 1 year, I will have it so, for a year is a great deal in my life." So, in a great hurry, where did Wren turn for inspiration? Well, in 1665, Charles II had sent Christopher Wren to Paris to see what the most modern buildings there look like. Charles, at that point, had hoped to rebuild his principal residence at Whitehall, and he hoped that Wren would be inspired by the royal buildings of Louis XIV that he himself had seen in and around Palace. The Great Fire of London intervened, and Wren, in the end, didn't rebuild Whitehall, but he did keep with him the vast collection of drawings, engravings, and notes that he had made on this crucial visit to France. And so when he was asked to rebuild Winchester, it was to his own French archive that he turned. And this is the building that he came up with. A great brick building with stone dressings, a flat balustrade, a big portico in the middle with a cupola, subsidiary porticos here, and then other buildings in this great sort of forecourt here for accommodating the court. This design was nothing if not French, profoundly influenced by Wren's first-hand experience of the architecture of Louis XIV's leading architect, Louis Laveau. Now, it's often, and I think rightly, remarked that Winchester owes a debt to Versailles, as first enlarged by Louis XIV by Laveau. You can see it in this slide, is this stepping back of the courtyards and this sort of great cour d'honneur in front of the palace. But I think people haven't concentrated quite so much on another, and to my mind, much more important inspiration. And that is Louis Lavau's Collège des Quatre Nations. The collège, which is now the Institut de France, was sited on the banks of the Seine, opposite the Louvre. So there it is, and here is the Louvre. And it was founded by Cardinal Mazarin in 1661. And unlike Versailles, this building was one of the buildings that Wren actually saw under construction when he was in Paris. And the library in it has long been recognised as having influenced Wren's design for Trinity Library, Cambridge. The college was, in many senses, the prototype for Winchester. Unlike Versailles, with which Winchester shared its receding courts, it was crowned with a dome above a portico, but also, and very importantly, it was brilliantly integrated into the Parisian cityscape. And in fact, the college was on a direct access with the king's bedroom, the French king's bedroom, Louis XIV's bedroom, in the Louvre. So it was axially placed, very, very carefully located. And it was this idea that Wren was then to take up at Winchester. Not a rural palace, a palace in a town that had an architectural and an axial relationship with other buildings. Now, Wren's first experiment in the manner of the college was at the Royal Hospital in Chelsea. And here you see the same principle, very weak dome in the middle, but basically you have a portico, you have a dome, you have these great wings jutting out. But the site at Winchester was much more exciting. I don't know how many of you know Winchester and where Winchester Castle is today, the medieval castle. You go up the hill, and the palace was to be sited at the top of the hill next door to the castle. So it had a very spectacular location. It was to be approached by a large cour d'honneur, exactly the same as Versailles and as the Collège. And it was crowned by these little cupolas, again in the same way as the college. But the really important thing is that the palace, which was at the top of the hill, was intended to be linked to the cathedral by a great new boulevard that was to be cut through the centre of the medieval town. This was a truly remarkable idea, one which Wren must have discussed in great detail with Charles II. Of course, in London, such a ceremonial route did exist. The Palace of Whitehall down here was linked to St Paul's Cathedral by the Strand and Fleet Street, and it was used, as it still is today, for great ceremonial events. But what Charles was doing at Winchester was creating a link between a royal palace and a cathedral. And this is my reconstruction of what was intended. Again, I published it in Country Life a couple of years ago. You can see here the palace at the top of the hill, the cour d'honneur, which goes down the hill in a series of stages. This is lower than this is lower than this is lower than this. And then, this is completely made up by me, I have to say, I suspect what would have happened as that great boulevard was driven through the centre of the town, it would have been redeveloped. and they would have built great houses for the aristocrats, looking rather like St. James's Square, and the whole thing was focused on the west front of the cathedral. So, a very grand conception, and this would have given the ability of Charles II to celebrate the great events of the reign, not in London, but at Winchester, because he had this relationship of palace and cathedral together. Thanksgivings, royal marriages, christenings, whatever it might be. So in 1684, the king returned to Winchester twice, briefly in June, and then again with the court for 4 weeks in late August and September. And after the June visit, in fact, furniture began to be sent down to Winchester from Whitehall in preparation for making the temporary lodgings more comfortable. But certainly, by this visit in late 1684, a substantial building was already on site. Most of the masonry was up, and the roofs had probably been started. And just before Charles's death, on the 6th of February 1685, he remarked to the Earl of Aylesbury, "I shall be most happy this week, for my building will be covered in lead." But Charles II's death was unexpected, and it brought building work at Winchester to an immediate halt. Now, it was common after Charles's death to believe that the purpose of Winchester was simply to replace Newmarket. John Evelyn tells us in 1685 that it was intended for a hunting house when His Majesty came to these parts, having an incomparable prospect. In about 1696, Celia Fiennes, on visiting the incomplete building, heard from the locals that it was for Charles II when he came to hunt and for air and diversions in the country. And Wren's son, in the biographical memoir that he wrote called Parentalia, also tells us that the best judges esteemed it an excellent model of a royal hunting seat. So does John Mackie in his journey through England, commenting on the deliciousness of the country for all manner of country sports. Daniel Defoe, who wrote in the 1720s, but who perhaps also visited Winchester earlier, believed that the house's principal function was for hunting, and if it was finished, it would have made that part of the country the Newmarket of the ages to come. However, unlike all other contemporary commentators, Daniel Defoe went on to observe that the design included a noble palace, sufficient, like Windsor, for a summer residence for the whole court. Defoe, unlike the others, realised that even in its incomplete state, Winchester Palace exceeded in size every other country house, and in fact was only exceeded in size by Windsor and Whitehall, the two palaces meant to accommodate the entire court for long periods of time. And when we look at the plan of Winchester Palace, it leaves us in absolutely no doubt that this was intended to be a substantial royal residence. Its western facade was longer than the eastern facade erected in the 1690s at Hampton Court. So you're standing at Hampton Court on the east front looking back. This is bigger than Wren's Hampton Court. And Winchester was to have provided more royal accommodation than Hampton Court. It had state apartments for the king. You came up the steps here. This is the first floor you're looking at, through a guard chamber, a presence chamber, through a gallery, an anteroom to the king's bedchamber, closet and private rooms. And on this side, through, rather oddly, a dining room for the king, but to the queen's apartments. And here were apartments for the duke and for the Duchess of York. On the floor below, there was also a substantial apartment for the Duchess of Portsmouth, the king's mistress, and there were additional lodgings for about 100 courtiers. Absolutely crucially, though, Winchester also had here, in these rooms here, a council chamber, and provisions for the royal clerks. Now, this is an extremely important point, because this very well-designed corner here, which was for the King's Council and for the transaction of state business, set Winchester apart from Windsor, which didn't have a council chamber, and the only place that really had facilities like this was actually Whitehall itself. And so what we're looking at here is not a hunting lodge. We're looking at a fully fledged major royal palace for which the king could go and he could govern the country from. Like Versailles, which you see here, Winchester was also set in a vast hunting park with a magnificent approach, completely unlike Newmarket, set in the middle of a town with no hunting park around it. And I think these features create the unassailable presumption that at Winchester, Charles II was building at the time of his death an alternative principal royal residence to Whitehall itself. Now, there are a couple of other pieces of evidence that would support this rather radical contention. The first is something that hasn't been noticed or commented upon before, which is that 1683, the year in which Charles II decided to build the palace at Whitehall, was also the year in which Louis XIV decided to move his court from the Louvre in the centre of Paris out to the Palace of Versailles. And everyone in Europe knew about Louis's decision. And so, could Charles II have been spurred on in his decision to move the headquarters of the monarchy from London to Winchester by Louis XIV's actions? Well, I think almost certainly this was a motivation. The French court was the most fashionable court in Europe, and as we've seen, Winchester was based on French royal buildings. And so I think Winchester was almost certainly deliberately designed by Charles to be England's Versailles. The presumption that Charles II was creating a new principal royal palace at Winchester and the rapidity with which in 1683 the choice was made suggests that he might have been considering potential sites for a new palace for some time. And I think this was certainly the case, because during the 1680s, the early 1680s, London was tremendously unstable. London, of course, had played a huge role in the downfall of his father. And during the late 1660s and into the 1670s, there were quite serious riots in London, including the Bawdy House riots, where the crowds chanted, "Before long, we will come and pull Whitehall down." Hardly very encouraging for a king who was sitting, really right in the middle of this great sort of howling mob. But much more serious, and I think certainly the spur for his decision to build at Winchester, was the extreme ferment in the capital caused by the exclusion crisis. And Charles's decision to summon Parliament in Oxford in March 1681 was an expression of the extreme unease with which he felt being in London. And of course, the following year, in November 1682, there were huge riots in London in favour of excluding James II from the throne. And I just don't think that it's in any coincidence that within 9 months of these riots in London, of moving Parliament out of London to get it away from all this disorder, that he decided to move his principal seat far from the metropolis. But this decision to build a major new palace in Hampshire broke with 200 years of royal building history. Because if you look at these maps, which I'm afraid are a bit faint on the screen, each dot represents a royal palace. And we're starting here in the 14th century, the 15th century, and going into the 16th century. And you'll see the tendency has been to increasingly concentrate royal palaces in the area round the Thames. And this was, of course, because access to the royal palaces was always by river. Here you see the famous woodcut of Whitehall, and you can see all the barges going up and down the river, and access to Greenwich and to Richmond and to all the main palaces was by barge. But by the 1630s, the royal barge had been essentially pensioned off for everything except for ceremonial use, and travel by coach had become the norm, and a network of roads had been built up between the major royal palaces to ensure quick and comfortable transport between them. So from at least the time of Charles I, if Charles wanted to go to Greenwich, he would have put his coach on the ferry, gone across at Lambeth, and would have gone south of the river down a royal road, specially reserved for the royal family to get to his palace. And so what the Winchester project illustrates, better than almost anything else, is the consequence of this change in the Crown's attitude to transport. In choosing this new site, it was crucial that there was a good road with appropriately placed bridges so that he could get from London to Winchester easily. And in fact, the fact that Hampshire had, in fact, very, very good roads, and John Ogilby's map, 1675, describes the state of the road between London and Winchester as very good, was a major factor in influencing Charles II's decision to go to Winchester. Another reason that I think he chose Winchester was the city's sort of fanatical royalism. Politically, going to Winchester was an obvious option. During the exclusion crisis, the city's royalist sympathies were confirmed when its members, in conjunction with the majority of Hampshire's MPs, stood firm in their support for the Duke of York, whom, together with the King, Winchester made an honorary freeman. After the dissolution of the Oxford Parliament, Hampshire dignitaries rallied to the Crown, and in October 1682, on the announcement of the choice of Winchester, it was said that the King was, and I quote, extremely satisfied with the loyalty of that city. Well, he might be, in light of the growing tension in Newmarket and London. The last factor, a very important factor in Winchester's favour, was the excellent accommodation it could offer for the supernumeraries of the court and administration, in telling contrast with almost anywhere else. A delve into the Winchester 17th century archives reveals that in 1686, Winchester could provide bedding for 336 people and stabling for 1,048 horses. In fact, only 5 other places in the kingdom had better supply of inns and taverns. In addition to these merits, Windsor's geographical position had much else to commend it. It was very close to the principal naval base at Gosport, which preoccupied a huge amount of Charles II's time. And so, really, all in all, Winchester was able to clean up. Well, Charles II died in February 1685. The very month, as I've said, lead was put on the roof. The interiors were not yet designed. The furniture wasn't even ordered. And England's Versailles remained uncompleted, and none of the king's successors returned to finish it. This seems like a rather depressing point to end on this evening, the failure, really, of Charles II's greatest project. But this was not, in the 17th century, to be the end of royal building ambition. For as we shall see in my next lecture, William III was to leave a much more tangible legacy for today than Charles II was able to. Thank you very much.